All right, church, we are back into our regular evangelism class Bible study material. If you have a handout, great. If not, we need to get one. We are finished up with our tactics stuff. The books and the DVD will be going into the library, as I said last week, so those will be available to you as well if you would like those. So we're going to go ahead and continue, and what I'd like to do tonight is look at some of the ways that we can prove the existence of God through various argumentation. And we'll get into that a little more depth here in a moment. Just so everybody is aware, this book by Dick Stanyo called Graceful Reason is in the library. It's pretty heavy philosophical material. But it is also very helpful. He does a great job of laying things out, and a lot of what we're going to look at tonight is derived from this material. I've tried my best to distill it and simplify it the best that we can. We're not going to get super in-depth on any of these arguments, but I have enough on our handouts that should hopefully give us a working knowledge, something that we can study and refer to get a decent grasp on these things. Some of them are easier to get a hold of than others. There's one in particular on the backside called the Ontological Argument. It's very philosophical. I have a very difficult time grasping it myself, but it's also not one that you're going to run into more than likely. But just for our own sake of knowing that it's out there and what it says, I have included it. So if you want to turn back over to the front page, we'll go through a little bit of a refresher and we'll get started. I want to re-emphasize again what the objective of this class is supposed to be. We are trying to prepare the congregation to engage in meaningful discussion about the Bible with potential converts, to deepen our own convictions of our faith, and to build confidence in defending that faith. We have an obligation to know why we believe what we believe. We need to be able to support that for our own sake. This class in particular will be dealing with the philosophical, and our hope is not to teach ourselves what to think, but how to think. We don't want to just be spoon-fed information and accept it. We want to be able to work through it, understand it fairly well, and be able to actually use it. And our desire is to come away with a well-reasoned and thought-out view of the world that we can share with others and use as a defense against opponents if necessary. Make sense? All right, so why do we need this class? We talked about this at the onset many weeks ago. We need this class because there is a continuing rise of secular humanism and atheistic indoctrination of our children especially, and the need for defending the faith and explanation of our faith has risen along with that. Many Christians struggle to defend their faith when asked to do so, and so the Christian religion is often dismissed as nothing more than fairy tales, outdated, irrelevant moral teachings, and a baseless religion with no foundation in reality. We might just call it a leap of faith. The Bible does not teach us to have a leaping blind faith. Our faith is one that is founded on evidence and truth. It is. So we'll get into some more of that. And our theme verse for this class, 1 Peter 3:15 through 16, is a reason why we need to have this class. It tells us, "In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." We need to have a defense. And I hope the materials that we're going to look at tonight will help us to be able to make that defense, so that we ourselves are not shaken, but that we can also help other people have a good biblical foundation and worldview. So, all of that being said, are there any comments or questions before we proceed? Going once? Going twice. Randy?
I stood there and said that.
Okay. Yep. All right, well, with that all said and done, let's go ahead and look at argument number 1. This is called the teleological argument. Now, In the real world, you're not going to need to know that name. But for our own sake, knowing what it is, the terminology, it's included. But really what this argument is dealing with is intelligent design, and whether or not there is or is not an intelligent designer. We can see that nature is extremely complex, from DNA, just DNA in itself, to single-celled organisms, from humans to insects, ecosystems, weather, and more. Despite its complexity, the universe has order to it, and the multiple systems mesh together as though they were purposefully designed to do so. Thus, we have what's called the teleological or the intelligent design argument. And so, if you look at your paper here, I have the proposals of the argument listed out. If you look at premise 1, if a thing contains information, then an intelligent being must exist who has the ability to act upon the thing so as to inform it. Does everybody understand what that's saying? If the thing contains information. There's an example that I've heard where a guy will talk about you have a book containing information. And what he's trying to say is that no one would say that this book gained all of this information within it without somebody from the outside putting that information in. It's basically what that's saying. So, moving on to number 2, the simplest living cells contain information, in fact, an enormous amount of information. So 3, we see our conclusion. Therefore, an intelligent being must exist who has the ability to act upon the thing so as to inform it. Does that check out with everybody? Can we see the logic behind that argument, how that's laid out? Now, there's an example that I found that really just astounded me to think about. I want to look at DNA for a minute, and the complexity that's within DNA, and how somehow all of that information within DNA works out to make sense and create life. So let's look at this example. DNA is a code of information necessary to build a living being. The human genetic code found in DNA has about 3.2 billion, with a B, billion sets of characters required to make a human being. That's just all the necessary pieces and parts of information, not the actual building itself. That just adds to the complexity of it. But just so we get an idea of how much information that is, it would take you typing 60 words per minute. How many of you can type 60 words per minute? We got one. I'm maybe 40. I'm terrible. I'm terrible at typing.
You mean without mistakes?
Without mistakes, I might be down to 19. One finger at a time. It would take you 60 words per minute of typing, 8 hours a day, for 50 years to type out all of those character sets contained within a single strand of DNA. That's a lot of information. I don't know how many characters are in this book. It takes a long time to read this book. It would be a library full of information. If you took every one of those strands in your DNA, in your body right now, and you stretched every one of them out end to end,
You'd probably die.
you would, yeah, you'd be a goner. You would be a goner. But if you could, look at this. It would stretch out 67 billion miles long. Maybe for some of us, it might be a little bit longer. But 67 billion miles long, if you were to stretch out all of that DNA. Another way of looking at it is 150,000 round trips to the moon. 150,000 round trips to the moon. All of the information that makes up you. And so the teleological argument says, okay, how did that happen? Was it by accident and random choice, or was it because somebody put that information together? I know which way I lean. I expect you do too. And we want to help people come to that same conclusion, that there is no way that it happened outside of a creator having input. Randy?
Every living thing plant or animal, even one-celled animals,
Mhm.
have DNA.
That's right. Every living thing has
So
DNA.
the first cell, you know, if you're saying life started with a one-celled animal, it still had to have that complex DNA to start.
That's a great point. Yeah, even a one-celled animal, they say that life evolved from a single cell. Well, just that one cell had to have enormous amounts of genetic information put together to create it. Terry?
I got a book on it, read it.
I got a lot of those.
And I believe the name of the signature is in the cell. And the guy says that, the scientists say the universe has been here for 30 billion years. In this book, the guy says it would take longer than 30 billion years to make one cell start on its own. It's that complex.
Mhm.
It's like a factory. It's unbelievable when you read some of the stuff, what a cell can do.
That's right. And the Darwinist, the evolutionist, has no other choice than just throw obscene amounts of time at the problem and hope that it somehow comes together. You hear something out there?
Tommy's back there.
Tommy's back. Okay, okay.
But our God spoke it into being.
Mm-hmm. That seems a lot simpler to me. So the question is, did all of that information found in DNA, is that the result of a nothing creating it, essentially? Because that's what the option is. Nothing made that, and it somehow happened, or did someone make it? Atheists, Darwinists, naturalists, and so forth, and those of similar thought are forced to conclude that all of this information that just created DNA is the result of natural events that somehow resulted in obscene amounts of genetic information forming and coming together in such a way as to create life. That seems ludicrous to me. Creationists, on the other hand, or at least those who subscribe to some sort of intelligent design, believe that a being outside of the observable universe exercised forethought and purposefully designed everything. So not only do we have these crazy amounts of information coming together and creating life, but then these life forms somehow form ecosystems that work together. You have the food chain that comes together and works together. You have climates that work together, and the changing of the seasons, the complexity of the universe, all works together somehow, in some way. So that is a breakneck speed breakdown of the teleological intelligent design argument. Any comments or questions before we move on to the second one?
Hard to fathom.
It is. It is hard to fathom.
It's mathematical. It's a mathematical impossibility based on that one cell becoming the complexity that it has become.
Right.
Which, you know, if a secularist or an evolutionist or a Darwinist, their faith in that has got to be, well, one, it's tainted.
Mhm.
Two, you know, it must be much stronger than believing in
Yeah.
God.
There's a good book out there called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," because it takes a greater amount of faith to buy into this happening by chance than that there is a creator outside of it that brought it into existence. That's a leap of faith, in my opinion. So thanks for bringing that up, Joe. All right, we'll move along to the second argument called Cosmological Argument. Now, just a helpful hint, cosmological, there's a hint within that name, cause. What is the cause? I don't know why it worked out that way, but that's just the way it did.
Spelled different.
It is spelled differently, but But that's what helped me remember it in school. The cosmological argument, what's that dealing with? Something has a cause.
Cause and effect.
Cause and effect. So, that is the argument in a nutshell. What caused it? What caused that? Back and infinitely until you come to an origin. This argument deals with the necessity of a creator. Everything within our universe, including the universe itself, has an origin. That origin must necessarily come from something that has no origin, or else we have a problem. We're going to get into that. This argument asks, or this is the argument that asks, well, where did that come from? And where did that come from? Essentially talks about a series of causes and effects that result in what we see today and tracing them back to their ultimate origin. Where did it actually ultimately start? So, what we have here is secularists. I'm just going to use that term generically to cover non-religious or non-intelligent design people. We'll just say secularists must prove the eternal origins of finite and contingent beings. Finite and contingent are defined as follows: restricted by time and space. They are able to be changed by something other than themselves. They have a beginning in time. They need things outside of itself to continue existing. Their attributes are to some extent influenced by other things. That's what we're dealing with in this argument. Is a thing contingent? Does everybody know what contingent means? For example, my existence is contingent upon me having parents. Likewise you, likewise them. They needed to have parents. Their existence is contingent on their parents. All the way back.
Hooked to something.
What's that?
Hooked to something.
Hooked to something? Based on?
Yeah.
Right? So it has a source outside of itself. And so the argument for the cosmological argument is laid out thusly. A contingent being exists. We would be contingent beings. The contingent being depends on something else for its existence, our parents. That which causes a contingent being must either be another contingent being or a non-contingent being. Our parents are contingent beings, obviously. That which causes the existence of contingent beings is either an infinite series of contingent beings or a non-contingent being, something that doesn't have a cause. It is false that what causes the existence of contingent beings is an infinite series of contingent beings. Therefore, what's our conclusion? That which causes the existence of a contingent being is a non-contingent being, and we would call that being God, the uncaused cause. Otherwise, like our argument put, you would have an infinite series. And if you have an infinite series, there's a problem baked into that. Where did that series begin? There's a problem. It just doesn't work. Does that make sense? Everybody clear on that? All right, we're going to...
But you can't use this language talking to someone.
No, you can't. No, you can't. So that brings up a good point. How would we simplify this argument to get somebody to see that there has to be an uncaused causer, a self-existent being that started it all?
In the beginning.
That's the biblical, right? That's the biblical way of doing it.
You just keep having them go back. Well, who were your parents' parents? Who were
Right.
their parents? Who were the kids? And you can only go back so far.
You can only go back
Get to
so far.
Adam and there's no go back.
What's the one we hear often about the origins of the universe?
Big Bang.
Big Bang. All right, take it further.
But something had to cause the Big Bang.
What was it?
Something had to be able to be a Big Bang.
What caused the Big Bang? All right, well,
God clapped his hands.
God clap his hand. So, all right, what caused the Big Bang? Well, what banged? What, right? They have to come up with something. What bang? Well, let's say it's some kind of a, what do they say, a singularity of really dense molecules or something like that. Well, what would you have to ask?
Where those molecules come
Where did those come from? So they have to conclude that the universe, or whatever caused the Big Bang, is what? Eternal. Always, it has always been there. That's what they're forced to conclude. So we have created matter that's always existed. It just doesn't check out. I saw a hand somewhere. Terry?
I was talking to one of my customers one time, a couple times, about the existence of God and stuff. And we went back to this same thing, the Big Bang. And he said, well, you got a point there. And one time he started, well, we're working on that.
We're working on that. Yeah, what? That's the universal scapegoat for these sort of things. Well, science just hasn't figured it out yet. We're working on that. How could these things be? We're just working on that. It's the same thing with the previous argument. With the just throw time at it. Time will fix it. Right?
Well,
Any?
the problem, one, the burden of proof is on them, okay, one of our tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And the other problem is if they walk away from it, nothing's resolved. Science is always changing something to fit a theory, or they find more facts that might help them, and if those facts don't coincide with their theory, they'll do one or two things. They'll either include it in the theory and change the theory, or they won't include it.
Yeah. Yeah, don't bring the information into the argument that hurts my point, right? That's how that's often handled. Any other comments or questions?
You remember that video in class that, who was it who showed, I think it was Dell, with the clock, where the clock comes from, or how is a clock created? Or is it, does it just make itself?
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what it was called, but it's a good video to show somebody.
Was it the blind watchmaker?
I think something like that.
Something like that. That's one of the counter arguments to this point. It's called the blind watchmaker. Was it Dawkins? Is it Richard Dawkins? I think his name. He's one of the famous militaristic atheists of our day. Talks about the blind watchmaker, and he basically just argues that nature itself, over time, has worked out all of these things to where it functions the way that it does. That information in more detail can also be found in here, but keep in mind we're going through this fast. Got a lot of stuff to cover, and if need be, we can also do some recap of this next week as well.
When you get to cause and effect, you still have, even if you were to grant them matter as being eternal, what causes things to happen? I mean, there's something that causes, if you have an effect, something
Yep.
had to cause it. And so, which then makes more sense by observation.
Mm-hmm.
Does matter have an influence on the spirit? I mean, does it create the spirit, or does spirit control matter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we say that kind of a cruel mind did this, or what kind of a great mind did that to get this effect. And so all of a sudden you're not dealing with something physical, it's something not tangible.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we call that the spirit world, then, which makes more sense.
Right, a supernatural
That
thing
spirit-
acting on the natural.
The spirit made and causes things, or that matter came up with the idea of cause.
Right.
And so that's even beyond just all the mathematical impossibilities and everything. They have no explanation for cause, really.
Mm-hmm.
They can say, oh, well, gravity does this, or But what caused gravity, you know?
No, that's a good point, Randy. And I want to bring this up. I think this is a good time to talk about it. This is philosophical. It is difficult to think about these things and make sense of them. But with that, there are people who are thinking about these sorts of things. And they're thinking about these things and coming to bad conclusions that don't reflect an accurate worldview, a biblical worldview. And so if we want to help those people defeat those bad worldviews, what do we have to have? We have to have a good worldview that's anchored in this sort of stuff. We can understand it and work with it, with them. Right? Right. There are people who are struggling with this kind of thing. We're not members of the church who need help. So, though it is difficult and a struggle to look at these things and understand them, it is a struggle that is worth going through, nonetheless.
And part of the problem is some of the people who are trying to come up with the answers have excluded the possibility of God. So their search is only in a way outside of God.
Right. Yeah, they need to know that the Christian faith and believing in God isn't an unreasonable thing. We have reasons to believe what we believe, and they're good reasons. We'll skip the ontological argument for now. We'll come back to that at the end, unless Joe, you're wanting to. Okay, that one I found a brief video to go with it because Dr. William Lane Craig explains it way better than I can. Way better than I can. So we'll go ahead and do the moral argument next. And this one, I believe, is one of the most powerful because we are a culture of feelings and emotions. And when morals are violated, people get very upset, and rightly so. But we need to know why there's a basis for being upset about certain things at all. And that's what the moral argument deals with. It deals with the existence of absolute and objective morals. And we know what absolute and objective mean, right? Absolute, it is absolute. Can't change it. It is what it is. Objective, it is a real, tangible thing. It's not subject to opinion. So there are absolute and objective moral laws. And what that means is it necessitates a moral law giver. Where did they come from? For this argument, we must ask the question, on what basis can a person say that a thing or an action is objectively and morally good or evil? On what basis? How do you come to the conclusion that it is right or wrong to do such and such a thing? Or that such and such a person is a good or evil person? Understand? Okay. If morals are strictly relative, another way of saying that is purely somebody's opinion. If they're strictly relative, human rights are nothing but an opinion with no real basis for their existence. It's just whatever this group of people says is right, and everybody else has to deal with it, whether that actually hurts a person or not. If morals are objective, even in part, and that's important because there are relative levels of goodness. One thing might be more good than another, and that's opinion. But if there's even if morals are objective, even in part, they must also have a basis from which they gain their objectivity. The why of their objectivity, and that why is the one who gave the morals in the first place. Where did those morals come from? God, the moral law giver. I know it's kind of heady, but let's look at some of this stuff here following. I took this from this book here, and I thought this was really good, and a better explanation of it than I could have put together. If God does not exist, and there are no ethical absolutes, then ethical relativism is true. Another way of saying that is whatever this person or group of people think is the right thing, the good and moral thing, then that's true. Ethics are ultimately man-made, and are defined in terms of either the individual or the group, if moral relativism is true. When we ask who or what creates moral obligation, three alternatives arise. Obligation is self-imposed, imposed by people, or imposed by God. If moral obligations are either self-imposed or imposed by people, they simply cannot be absolute. So, if you and I determine, and let's say you and I create a moral law that says this is immoral, or we collectively say this is immoral, is that law objective or subjective? Subjective. Why is that?
That's what we think.
It's what we think. So
Subject to opinion.
it's subject to our opinion. What if the group down the street comes in and has the exact opposite opinion? Who's right?
We are, of course.
We are, and they are. And then what happens? You got fighting. So what we're looking for is objective moral laws. That is a morality that is universally applied between all groups. And we have to determine where that law comes from. I know it's rough. Hang with me. So, let's look at the argument put forth. If there is some objective standard which is other than the particular moral code of any individual or society, and which has an obligatory character which can be recognized, then God exists. There is some objective standard which is other than the particular moral code of an individual society. Another way of saying that is outside of just what a group of people think, and which has an obligatory character. That means they're held to it, accountable to it, which can be recognized. Therefore, God exists. And we see the logical progression to that. There's an objective moral law outside of what any group of people thinks. Therefore, somebody gave that law, that person is God.
That's another way of saying there are some laws that are universally the same throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And every nation has laws against most of those things that we would call moral laws. Now, there are laws that aren't necessarily moral or immoral, but matters of legality, speed limits and stuff like that, fines. But basically, in Romans, Paul says they were a law unto themselves. Basically, I gave them a conscience, and man knows that there are just some things you do not do. It's not right. And there's even a saying, there's honor among thieves. Even thieves recognize that though they steal, you don't steal from one another. So, there's
Right.
honor among thieves. That is, they recognize a universal law.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. Let's take this into the real world based on that. If morality is completely relative and subjective to opinions, is it wrong for somebody to come in and murder a family? Objectively wrong.
Yes.
And a purely subjective,
Now, you
relative.
changed from objective to subjective.
What did I say? I'm sorry.
You said objective.
It is objectively wrong.
It is.
It is. I agree. Just so we're clear, I don't think anybody should go in and do that.
Okay.
But in a purely subjective society, where all morals are relative and subjective to that group, you have no basis to say that it is absolutely, objectively wrong to do that. You can't say that genocide is objectively wrong in a completely subjective moral framework. Make sense? There are no human rights. There's no basis to say that is universally wrong if it's completely subjective. So the fact that you can objectively say that there is things that are wrong shows that objective truth came from somewhere. And what is that somewhere? Who is that someone that gave it? We conclude it's God. The atheist doesn't have any basis for morality other than their opinion.
See, I think that's the problem we have in our society today. Because there's the one group, us, who says our morality comes from God. The nation was built on God, on those principles. But then there's the other side that does not consider that. And so whatever they side's right is right, whatever they side is wrong is wrong.
Right. Outside of we'll even go generic, outside of a religious framework, the world has no basis for its morality other than just their agreed upon rules, subject to change. That's also the dangerous part. So.
That's why you have different laws in different communities.
Mm-hmm.
There are some laws that it doesn't matter, it depends on what they want to set for their community.
Yep.
But there are basic things that every community agrees on.
Yep.
And it's just, has to come from somewhere.
Where I come from, that's not right.
Where I come from, that's not
Where
right.
you're from, that's right.
Yeah. Where she comes from, it's always right, even where you come from. She's gonna be right. All right. Well, if all of that was rough on you, if that was rough on the mind, buckle up, because this is the worst of the four. The ontological argument, like I said, I struggled with this one all the way through school. I don't quite get it now, but again, I've included it just because, well, maybe one of you will get it and can explain it to me. But we'll quickly go through this, and we've got a video that might clear the mud a little bit, and we'll wrap up for the evening. I'd encourage you to go back and reread through this, think about the arguments, how it's laid out, spend some time just stewing on it, marinating in it. It's not that bad when you break it down into its simplest form, I promise. So the ontological argument. This argument deals with the conceivability or the possibility of a maximally great being, God, existing in the real world. Maximally great meaning absolutely superlative in every way, i.e. his having a transcendent nature, sovereignty, omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, etc. If a being of this sort exists in any possible conceived world, it would by definition and its nature exist in every possible world, including the real world in which we live.
So what's wrong with that?
You got it?
Yeah, got it, agreed.
All right, let's talk after class, because I...
Basically, what it's saying is, how can a whole world of people want a God, a being greater than, if man can conceive that there's something greater than man,
Mhm.
there must be something to that.
That's probably part of it.
Yeah, that's what my philosophy teacher said.
Hey, more power to you. I didn't have a philosophy teacher. So here's the argument broken down. We'll go through this quickly. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. That's the premise. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, the maximally great being exists, or beings exist in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Therefore, God exists.
Amen.
Amen.
Someone paid somebody big bucks to come up with that.
I know. It was Anselm in like 1163. It's in the video. We'll see. Anselm came up with this. Talk to him. The argument hinges on the question, is it possible that God exists? The atheist has to maintain that it is impossible for God to exist in any way, shape, or form, in any world, imaginary or otherwise. And other arguments that we've looked at show that it is at least logically possible that God, this maximally great being, exists. It's at least possible. So the atheist, by this argument, loses. He can't hold to the fact that it is impossible in any way, shape, or form that God does not exist. So I'm going to stop talking on that one and let a much smarter guy with a PhD try to explain it. So go ahead, Joe.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the Ontological Argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers, such as Charles Alphon, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically impossible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist. However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies. It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
clearing the mud,
I
right?
understand it, believe it or not.
Good. So,
David, would you
Yes.
like to read Anselm's workbook?
no.
Good choice.
No, I'm good. Maybe another day I'll read Anselm's book. For right now, I'm good. So those are our four main arguments I wanted to look at this evening. Granted, difficult stuff. It's difficult. Hopefully, it has fortified your own faith in some degree, in some way. Maybe hearing some of these arguments laid out has given you a little bit something more to cling on to. Again, I would encourage you to look back over this list and the arguments, how they're put forth, and just wrestle with them. Spend some time wrestling. And if you have any additional questions on them, let me know. Any comments or questions before we finish out tonight's study? All right, well, thank you all for your participation and helping this class to be somewhat enjoyable. Thank you all.
Let's go get
Get some pizza.